The diary was small enough to fit inside a flour sack, and that is exactly where it was kept. A brown leather cover worn soft at the corners, the initials REH stamped in gold that had mostly flaked away. When the family found it, generations later, in the bottom of a cedar chest, they thought at first it was an account book. The handwriting was that careful, that controlled, a schoolteacher's hand, each letter formed with precision, nothing wasted, nothing spilled. They were wrong about the account book. On 37 of the 79 pages, the last line of the day's entry read exactly the same. He means nothing to me, sometimes underlined, sometimes not. Written once on the night of June 3, 1853, then again on June 4, then skipped for 4 days. Those 4 days notable because every sentence in them mentioned him by name, and then written again on June 9th with such force that the pen had nearly torn the page. He means nothing to me. The woman who wrote it was named Ruth Haines. She was 31 years old. She had been a schoolteacher in Coshocton County, Ohio, for 9 years, and she had agreed reluctantly to leave everything she knew and walk 2,000 miles west with her younger brother's family because there was nothing left in Ohio that she could bear to look at anymore. The man she kept writing about was named Thomas Marsh. He was the wagon captain assigned to the Haines party's train out of Independence, Missouri in the spring of 1853. He was 38 years old, a widower with no children, with a scar along his left jaw that he would not explain and a way of looking at a situation, any situation, as though he had already calculated every possible way it could go wrong. Ruth found him intolerable from the first morning. She wrote that too. The wagon train left Independence on the 14th of May, a Wednesday, with 22 wagons and somewhere close to 90 souls, counting the children who were too small to walk, and the elderly who were too worn to do much more than ride and pray. Ruth's brother Daniel had the second wagon from the front. His wife Clara sat on the bench with their infant daughter pressed against her chest in a sling of blue calico. Their 2 older boys, ages 5 and 7, ran alongside the wheels for the first 3 miles before Clara called them back. Ruth walked. She had decided before they left that she would walk as much as she was able. She did not think she could bear to sit and watch the miles go by. Motion, she had found in the months since the funeral, was the only thing that kept the weight of grief from settling too heavily in her chest. As long as she was moving, she was doing. As long as she was doing, she did not have to feel. She had been engaged to a man named Robert for 6 years. They had delayed the wedding twice, once when his mother fell ill, once when the crops failed and they needed another season's saving. The third date had been set for March of 1852. Robert died of a fever in October of 1851, 5 months before they were to be married. She did not write much about Robert in the trail diary. She had written about him in a different diary, the one she kept through that winter, and she had burned it in the kitchen stove in February because she could not go west carrying that weight too. What she carried instead was her schoolteacher's precision, her brother's optimism, and a brown leather diary with 79 empty pages. She filled the first page the night before they left. The last thing she wrote was, "Tomorrow it begins. I intend to make something of it." Thomas Marsh gave his first address to the wagon train on the morning of the 15th, standing on the seat of his own wagon at the front of the line. He was not a tall man, but he had the kind of stillness that makes a space quiet without anyone quite understanding why. He told them what they were about to do and what it was going to cost them. He did not dress it up. "The trail to Oregon City is 2,170 miles, he said. "You will walk most of it. Your livestock will suffer. Some of them will not make it. I tell you this now so that you understand. This is not a journey where things go according to plan. Things will go wrong. The question is what you do when they do." Ruth, standing near the back of the crowd, wrote the whole speech down in her diary that evening. She noted that he had said you when he meant we, as though he were not making the journey himself but merely supervising it from some elevated remove. She wrote, "The captain is the sort of man who has decided that competence is a sufficient substitute for warmth. He may be right about the crossing of rivers. He is not right about people." Then she wrote the date. Then she wrote, "He means nothing to me." It was the first time. She did not know then that she would write it 36 more times before she reached the Willamette Valley. The first weeks were not terrible. The trail through eastern Kansas was flat and the grass was still green, and in the evenings the families built their fires in a rough circle and the children played in the long prairie light while the women cooked and the men checked the wagon wheels and the oxen's feet for stones. Ruth helped Clara with the baby, helped the boys with their letters by the last of the firelight, and wrote in her diary every night with the care of a woman who understood that writing things down was a way of keeping hold of yourself when everything else was moving. She wrote about the meadowlarks that rose up out of the grass in great startled arcs as the wagons passed. She wrote about the smell of the prairie at first light, damp and green and vast, before the heat settled in and turned everything brown at the edges. She wrote about Clara's cooking, which was better over an open fire than it had ever been in Ohio. She wrote about Daniel's laugh, which she had not heard enough of in the last year and a half. She wrote about Thomas Marsh only when he could not be helped. June 2nd. The captain reprimanded the Henderson family for overloading their wagon. He was not wrong. He was also not kind about it. June 4th. He stopped to help the Morrison boy catch a runaway ox this morning. He did not make anything of it. Just caught the animal and handed back the rope. June 4th, last line, he means nothing to me. The cholera came into their train 10 days west of Fort Kearny at roughly mile 320. A child first, the youngest of the Morrison family, barely 2 years old, and then the child's mother, and then 2 men from the wagon behind them who had shared a water jug at the noon stop. Ruth had seen cholera before, in Ohio, but nothing prepared her for the speed of it on the trail. A person could be walking at breakfast and gone by nightfall, and the wagon train could not stop, could not afford to stop, and so the dying happened in moving wagons while the healthy kept walking, which was its own kind of cruelty that Ruth could not find a word for in any language she knew. She helped nurse the sick. There was no choice. The train had no physician, only a woman named Agatha who had come west 3 times before and who moved through the cholera camp with a grim efficiency that Ruth found more comforting than any amount of reassurance would have been. Thomas Marsh dug the graves himself, all 4 of them. He dug them with one other man who had volunteered, and when they were done he stood at the head of each in turn and said whatever could be said, which was not much, but he said it. He stood at Mrs. Morrison's grave with his hat in his hands for a full minute after the words were done. The sky was enormous above him. The train waited. That night Ruth wrote 3 full pages in her diary, and at the end she wrote, "I do not know what the captain was thinking at the graveside. It was not my business to know. Then he means nothing to me." She underlined it twice. They reached Fort Laramie on the 15th of July at mile 645, and the relief of solid walls and unfamiliar voices landed on Ruth like shade after a long walk in sun. She posted a letter home to her friend Margaret in Coshocton. She bought a new tin of writing ink. She sat on a bench outside the sutler's store and let the afternoon fall on her face and did not think about anything for 20 minutes, which was longer than she had managed since independence. Thomas Marsh found her there. He had not sought her out. She was certain of that later. He was coming out of the sutler's store with a coil of rope and he simply stopped when he saw her, and instead of continuing, he sat down at the other end of the bench. "You doing all right?" he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly in 2 months that wasn't about the position of her brother's wagon. "Yes," she said. "You helped Agatha with the cholera camp for 3 days." "I did. That was a hard thing." She looked at him. He was watching the parade ground, not her. His hat was in his hands, turning slowly by the brim. She had the sudden, disorienting sense that he was doing the same thing she was, simply being still for a moment, inside a place with walls, before the next stretch of open sky. "It was necessary," she said. "I didn't do anything Agatha didn't do twice over." He was quiet. Then he said, "Agatha's done it so many times she's built a door between herself and it. You don't have that door yet, I could tell." She did not know what to say to that. She looked at the parade ground, too. "You were a teacher," he said. It was not a question. "I was, probably will be again on the other end." "Oregon needs teachers," he said. More than it needs most things. He stood, resettled his hat, and said, "We leave at first light. Get some sleep if you can." Then he walked away. Ruth sat on the bench for another 10 minutes. Then she went back to the wagon and wrote in her diary, "He sat beside me today for perhaps 8 minutes. He said that I don't have a door between myself and what I've seen, which is the most observant thing anyone has said to me since Ohio. He also said Oregon needs teachers, which is something a man says when he has run out of other things to say and doesn't know how to leave. He means nothing to me." But she did not underline it that night. She wrote it, and closed the diary, and lay on her back in the dark listening to the camp settle into sleep, and she thought about a man who had been on this trail 11 years and could read a situation faster than most people could read a room. She thought, what kind of man chooses that life? What kind of man has been crossing 2,000 miles of wilderness every year for 11 years and has never yet decided to stop? She did not answer the question. She was not ready. After Fort Laramie, the prairie fell away and the land changed into something Ruth had not been prepared for. The grass grew shorter and disappeared almost entirely, replaced by dust and sage and rock the color of dried blood. The wind came from directions that had no logic. At South Pass, 7,412 feet, the high point of the trail, the place where the continent divided, her lungs worked harder for each breath, and the mornings were cold even in July, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough that the baby woke crying in the night. It was at South Pass that her brother Daniel took sick, not cholera, something duller and more persistent, a fever that would not break, a cough that came in the night and kept Clara awake while the boys slept through it somehow. Daniel walked for 2 days after the fever started because he would not ride. He said a man who couldn't walk his own wagon wasn't worth the feed his oxen required, and no amount of argument from Ruth or Clara could move him. On the 3rd day he rode. Ruth walked beside the wagon and listened to her brother's breathing and felt a specific fear that has no name. The fear that the people you have come 2,000 miles to protect might not arrive with you. Thomas Marsh appeared beside her at the noon stop on Daniel's 4th day. "His color is better today," he said. "You've been watching," she said. "It's my job to watch." "He's not a wagon wheel," she said. "He's my brother." "I know that." He looked at the wagon where Clara sat with the baby and Daniel slept on a rolled blanket behind her. "The fever broke last night. I could hear it from 2 wagons up. The cough changed. A wet cough sounds different from a dry one. He'll be on his feet in 3 days. She stared at him. "You can tell that from the sound of a cough? I've been on this trail 11 years, he said. "You hear a lot of coughs." She turned away before he could see what had happened to her face. The relief was too large. She did not want him to see it. That evening she wrote, "He told me Daniel would recover before I had let myself believe it. He said he could hear it in the cough. I didn't know whether to be grateful or furious that I hadn't been watching as carefully as he had. Both, probably. Mostly grateful. He means nothing to me." Daniel was on his feet in 4 days, not 3, which Ruth noted with a particular kind of satisfaction she kept entirely to herself. The trail through present-day Idaho was the hardest stretch yet. The Snake River Plain was black volcanic rock and alkaline dust that coated everything. Teeth, lungs, the creases of knuckles. Thomas Marsh marked each dangerous water source with a white rag tied to a stick and told the train at morning briefing to let the animals drink only from sources he had cleared. 2 of the Henderson family's oxen drank from an unmarked spring on a day when the Hendersons had fallen behind and missed the briefing. 1 died that evening. The other recovered, barely, over 3 slow days. The Hendersons did not fall behind again. It was in Idaho, at a campfire on the evening of August 29th, that Ruth overheard the conversation. She had gone to refill her water jug and stopped when she heard Thomas's voice on the other side of the wagon, talking with a man named Howard, a farmer who had been in Oregon for 5 years and was returning west with his wife's family. "That school teacher in your train," Howard was saying. "Haney's sister. She going to settle permanent?" "That's her intention," Thomas said. "Good woman to know. Oregon's full of men who'd marry a school teacher." A pause. "I expect she'll do fine," Thomas said. "You not tempted yourself?" Howard said, and there was a laugh in it. Another pause. Longer. I'm not a settling man, Thomas said. Never have been. I'll take this train to Oregon City and I'll be back east by November. That's the life I run. Ruth walked away before she heard anything else. She stood in the dark between two wagons and held the empty water jug and felt something she could not immediately name, and then she could. It was not surprise. It was the specific disappointment of having your own good sense proven right when you had been quietly, privately hoping it was wrong. That night she wrote without lighting the lamp, the letters jagged, harder to read than usual. I was a fool to let the Fort Laramie bench mean anything. I was a fool to count the times he appeared beside me on the trail as though there were a pattern to them. He is a man who runs this trail the way other men run a mill. Efficient, practiced, entirely uninterested in what the mill produces. The people. The families who imagine at the end of all this a home. He means nothing to me. She underlined it, then she underlined it again. Then she put the pen down and lay in the dark and did not sleep. The Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon arrived in September like a wall. After weeks of open sky and flat horizon, they rose up without ceremony. The trail through the Blues was narrow and forested and steep. The wagons lowered down the worst pitches by rope while the women and children walked ahead and the animals were led around the sharpest grades. The work was slow and exhausting and took a toll on every piece of equipment the train had kept functioning through 1,200 miles of prairie and rock. On the third day in the mountains, the 17th of September, Daniel's wagon lost a wheel. Not cracked, lost. The iron rim had been weakening since Wyoming, and on a steep downhill pitch it gave way all at once, and the wagon lurched hard to the right. Ruth, walking 10 feet ahead, turned at the sound and saw it happening as though time had gone thick and slow. The wagon tilting, the oxen stumbling sideways, Clara grabbing the baby, the boys scrambling. Thomas Marsh was there before the wagon finished settling. Somehow, impossibly, he was there. His hands on the left front wheel, his weight thrown against the tilt of it, and two other men beside him who had appeared from nowhere, and together they held it. They held it for 3 full minutes while Clara got the baby clear and the boys scrambled free and Daniel, still not at full strength, climbed down the wrong side of the seat and fell and got up again. When the wagon was stabilized, Thomas assessed the damage. The wheel was beyond repair on the trail. The rim was in 3 pieces. Without that wheel, the wagon could not move. Without the wagon, Daniel's family lost everything they were carrying: provisions, seeds, tools, the chest of Clara's mother's things that she had refused to leave behind in Ohio. Thomas said, "I have a spare rim." Ruth turned to look at him. "On my wagon," he said. "I've been carrying it since Fort Bridger." "That's your emergency stock," Daniel said. "You can't." "I can give it to you or I can sell it to you," Thomas said. "But it's going on your wheel either way. Work out which you'd prefer while we start the repair." Daniel said he would pay for it. Thomas said he'd think about the price and tell him when they reached Oregon City. He never told him a price. When Daniel raised it afterward, Thomas said he had forgotten what he'd paid for it at Fort Bridger, which was not true, and they both knew it. But that was not the moment. The moment came 3 hours into the repair, when Ruth brought Thomas a cup of coffee and he took it without looking up from the rim he was setting, and she said, "You won't be able to leave by November now." He looked up. "Without that spare rim, you've lost your margin," she said. "You said you're always back east by November. You'll have to winter in Oregon." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I suppose I will." "You gave away the thing that was keeping you on schedule," she said, "for a spare wheel rim, for your brother's family," he said. She stood there with the empty coffee cup and looked at him, and she could not think of a single thing to say. She was not a woman who ran out of words. She had been filling pages for months, and now, in the mountain air that smelled of fir and cold and the coming snow, she had nothing. "Go get warm," he said quietly. "It's going to be cold tonight." She walked back to the fire. She did not write in her diary that night. She sat with Clara and the baby and the boys and Daniel, who was holding the lantern for the repair despite being forbidden to work, and she sat by the fire and thought about a man who had been on this trail for 11 years and had never once decided to stay, and who had just, quietly and without ceremony, given away the thing that would have let him leave. They came out of the Blue Mountains on the 22nd of September, into a valley that was the most deliberately beautiful thing Ruth had ever seen. Green in a way that the prairie never managed. Full green, the kind that means water and permanence, the Willamette Valley. The end of the trail. Oregon City was not grand. It was a rough timber town on the bank of the Willamette River, loud with mills and muddy with the autumn rains that had already started. But the people in the wagon train stopped at the bluff above the falls and stood there and were, for a moment, entirely still. Ruth stood among them. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, over the place where the weight of grief had lived since Ohio, and she felt it shift. Not gone, not yet, but different. The way a stone worn smooth by water is still a stone, but no longer sharp. She found Thomas Marsh at the front of the train, as always, standing with his horse and watching the valley below. She watched him for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the way he always seemed to be measuring the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. He had nowhere to be this winter. He had given that away on a mountain road. She walked forward. She did not know exactly what she would say. She knew it had something to do with a bench in Fort Laramie, and the sound of a cough in the night and 37 diary entries that had all ended the same way and were all, every one of them, wrong. She knew it had something to do with the fact that a man who claimed not to be a settling man had just settled himself, quietly, into another Oregon winter, and had not once mentioned it as a sacrifice. She reached him. He turned. "We made it," she said. "You made it," he said. "Most of the credit belongs to the people doing the walking." She looked at the valley. "What will you do this winter?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about that. There's land available, east of the falls. I've looked at it on 3 crossings now. Always thought it was more than one man needed." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "I thought," he said, carefully, "the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed a thing and is not entirely certain the rehearsal was enough, that you might know someone who needed to stop moving for a while. Get to something solid. A house, a school, something that stays in one place." The falls were loud below them. Around them, the people of the wagon train were separating into their separate futures, calling to each other, crying, laughing, pressing hands. The whole long human noise of arrival. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "I might know someone like that," she said. That evening, in the last entry of the brown leather diary, Ruth Eliza Haines wrote 3 pages. She wrote about the valley and the falls and the color of the Willamette at dusk. She wrote about the trail, all of it, compressed into a single long paragraph. The meadowlarks rising from Kansas grass, the pewter plat, the 4 graves at Fort Kearney, the bench at Fort Laramie, the sound of her brother's cough changing in the night, the Blue Mountains and the smell of fir trees when you have earned them. At the very end, she wrote, 2,170 miles, 79 days. 37 times I wrote the same lie in this book and told myself I believed it. She looked at what she had written. Then she added, in the same careful schoolteacher's hand, "He means everything." She closed the diary and set it inside the flour sack where it had lived for the entire crossing. She walked out to find him. He was standing at the edge of the bluff, watching the valley go dark below, the way he always watched things, already thinking about what came next. "Ready?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "You?" She looked down at Oregon City, at the lights coming on in the windows one by one, at the river catching the last of the evening sky. "Yes," she said. They went down together.